As my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me. He succeeds me as Duke of Cornwall.
The gates of Buckingham Palace have never felt heavier than they do today, not since the abdication crisis of 1936, when Edward VIII surrendered the crown for love, has the British monarchy stood at such a crossroads. But what is unfolding right now, behind those imposing iron gates, inside those gilded corridors, makes that moment look like a rehearsal. King Charles III, the man who waited 7 decades for the crown, the man who buried his mother, stood in the rain at her funeral, and carried the weight of an entire nation on his aging shoulders, is preparing to do the unthinkable. He is stepping down, and not quietly, not with a whispered resignation or a carefully managed press release. King Charles is preparing to deliver a final address, a farewell to power, that will formally declare the beginning of the reign of King William V and Queen Catherine. But here is what the official palace statements will never tell you. The real story behind this abdication did not begin in a throne room. It began in a private meeting room, with a woman scorned, a son betrayed, and a king who finally found the steel he had been searching for his entire life. What drove Charles to this moment? What really happened when Queen Camila stood up and shattered the silence at that secret family gathering? And why is Camila, the woman Charles risked everything to love, suddenly nowhere to be seen? Stay with us, because this story goes far deeper than a coronation announcement. The weight of a crown. To understand why King Charles is abdicating, you first have to understand what wearing that crown actually cost him. Charles Philip Arthur George was not born to be a relaxed monarch. He was born to wait. For decades, through scandal, through heartbreak, through the loss of the most beloved princess the world had ever seen. He waited, patient, disciplined, enduring. When Queen Elizabeth II finally passed on September 8, 2022, Charles was 73 years old. He was the oldest person in British history to ascend to the throne. Most men his age are retiring. Charles was just getting started. His coronation on May 6, 2023, at Westminster Abbey was magnificent. Gold, pageantry, ancient ritual. The whole world watched, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though this complicated, misunderstood, deeply private man had finally arrived at his destiny. But destiny has a cruel sense of timing, because almost immediately after the crown was placed on his head, the shadows began to gather. His health, long a subject of palace whispers, became impossible to ignore. The cancer diagnosis that rocked the royal family in early 2024 sent a chilling message through the institution. The king was mortal. The succession was no longer a distant concern. It was urgent. And then there was the internal fracture, the fault line that had been quietly widening beneath the polished surface of royal life. Think about what the royal family had faced in just the years immediately surrounding Charles's coronation. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had detonated bombshell after bombshell from across the Atlantic. Prince Andrew remained a permanent source of institutional shame. The press was relentless. The public mood was shifting. William and Catherine, however, were different. Through Catherine's own devastating cancer diagnosis and her extraordinary recovery, through the couple's carefully managed return to public duties, through William's increasingly confident appearances on the world stage, something remarkable was happening. The British public was not simply tolerating the Prince and Princess of Wales. They were falling in love with them, profoundly, genuinely, in a way that reminded older generations of a princess who had walked those same gilded halls 3 decades before. Charles saw it. Of course he saw it. And here is the question that must have kept him awake in those long nights at Sandringham. At what point does a king's greatest act of service to the monarchy become the act of stepping aside? The secret meeting. Nothing about what happened next was announced. Nothing was leaked to the press. No calendar invitations were sent through official channels. And yet, inside the private meeting rooms of Buckingham Palace, a gathering took place that would alter the course of British royal history. King Charles called it. He called it quietly, deliberately, and with the full understanding of what he was about to declare. The room itself tells you everything about the weight of the moment. Crystal chandeliers casting golden light across polished wooden floors, royal portraits on every wall, those permanent silent witnesses to centuries of triumph and catastrophe. And around the long table, the faces of the family Charles had spent his entire reign trying to hold together. Prince William arrived with the composed bearing of a man who already sensed the magnitude of what was coming. Beside him, Princess Catherine, still radiating that extraordinary calm elegance that had become her trademark, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the very picture of the stability the British public had craved for years. And then there was Queen Camilla. Charles rose to speak, and from the first sentence, the room understood this was not a routine briefing. His voice was low, steady, but laced with something they had never heard in it before, a finality, the kind of finality that cannot be walked back. He spoke of time, of duty, of the invisible weight that health places on a sovereign who refuses to acknowledge his own limitations. He spoke of what the monarchy needed, not sentimentally, but with the cold clarity of a man who had done the arithmetic and accepted the answer. And then he said it. He formally declared his intention to abdicate, to transfer the central power of the crown to Prince William and Princess Catherine, to place the future of the British monarchy, that ancient, battered, resilient institution, in the hands of the next generation. The room did not erupt, it did not gasp. It plunged into a silence so profound that the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece sounded like thunder. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Catherine's composure remained immaculate, but her eyes, those deeply perceptive eyes, betrayed everything. This was real. This was happening. And then came the sound that shattered it all, the sharp scrape of a chair being dragged across the stone floor. Queen Camilla rose. Now, before we go further, ask yourself this. What would possess a woman who had fought her entire life for the legitimacy she finally possessed to stand up in that room and challenge the king himself? What was she protecting? Was it the monarchy? Was it Charles? Or was it something far more personal and far more dangerous? Camilla's intervention. The woman who rose from that chair was not the warm, self-deprecating Camilla the public had gradually come to accept. This was a different version entirely. Her face could not conceal the tension coiling beneath the surface. Her eyes, usually carrying that studied warmth, now burned with something sharper, something defiant. She spoke with the measured authority of someone who had spent years learning exactly how to frame objection as wisdom. William, she argued, was still too young, still too inexperienced in the ancient customs and protocols that formed the genuine bedrock of the institution. The timing, she insisted, was catastrophically premature. The words sounded reasonable. They were designed to sound reasonable. But the room was watching her hands, the way her fingers whitened around the strap of her handbag, the barely perceptible tremor at the corner of her mouth. These were not the movements of a concerned stateswoman. These were the movements of a woman watching her life's work being dismantled in real time. Because the brutal truth, the truth that everyone in that room understood, was this. Camilla's entire identity, her entire hard-won legitimacy, her very purpose, was constructed around one axis: her role as the power beside Charles, the woman who shaped his thinking, the queen consort who had transformed herself from the most reviled figure in British public life into an accepted, if never quite beloved, member of the royal family. Take Charles's power away, transfer it to William, and what exactly remains? Her interruption struck the room like a blade through silk. Charles stood frozen. You have to imagine the internal landscape of that moment for him. This was not a political opponent. This was not a hostile journalist or a resentful courtier. This was the woman he had loved for most of his adult life, the woman for whom he had endured decades of public hatred, the woman whose hand he had held through every storm, every scandal, every brutal headline. And she had just humiliated him, publicly, in front of his son, in front of his daughter-in-law, in front of the people to whom he was attempting to pass the most sacred trust in British public life. His face shifted. Those who were watching said it moved through crimson to a deathly pallor within seconds. A fracture was spreading. You could feel it even if you couldn't see it. It was William who steadied the moment. He rose from his chair without drama, moved to his father's side, and with the measured tone of a man already operating from a position of authority, quietly announced that the meeting would adjourn so that everyone could reflect. It was graceful. It was decisive. and it sent a message that was impossible to misread. The gathering broke apart in haste, but as Camilla's figure disappeared through the grand doors, every person left in that room understood one thing with absolute clarity. Nothing inside Buckingham Palace would ever be the same again. The private reckoning. The door to the king's private study closed with a sound like a verdict being delivered. Inside, the familiar scent of sandalwood and old paper, the smell of Charles's entire adult life of preparation and patience, now felt suffocating. He stood with his back to the door, his shoulders carrying the particular tension of a man who has just experienced a betrayal so deep that his body has not yet found a language for it. His hands, those hands marked by time that had shaken 1,000 diplomatic hands and signed 1,000 official documents, gripped the edge of the oak desk until the knuckles went white. Camila had followed him. She stood in the center of the room, her chin lifted in that manner she had cultivated over decades, the posture of a woman accustomed to being heard and obeyed. But her eyes told a different story. Behind the performance of confidence, there was fear, real fear, the kind that arrives when a person realizes they have pushed things past the point of retrieval. She spoke, and what she said in that room, according to those who have since been told of it in confidence, represents perhaps the single most consequential act of misjudgment in the modern history of the royal family. She reached back past the crown, past the palace, past the decades of shared life. She reached back into the darkest corners of Charles's most guarded personal history. She invoked the memories he had spent a lifetime trying to bury, the childhood miseries of Gordonstown boarding school, the place Charles himself once described as a kind of private hell, the loneliness, the bullying, the profound unhappiness of a sensitive boy thrown into a brutally harsh environment with no emotional rescue in sight. She had known these things because Charles had trusted her with them. In the small hours of their most intimate moments, he had whispered to her the parts of himself that he had shown no one else. And now, in the desperation of this moment, she made clear, through implication, through calculated suggestion, that those secrets need not remain private. It was a threat, a breathtaking, catastrophic, irreversible threat, and it did not break Charles. It rebuilt him. He turned around slowly, and the eyes that met hers were not the eyes of the man she thought she knew. The vulnerability that had defined him, the endless search for approval, the ancient need for comfort and validation, was gone. In its place was something harder, something final. He understood, perhaps in that very instant, that the woman beside him had not been the refuge he believed. She had been, in her own way, a kind of captor, and the cage door had just swung open. He stepped to his desk, picked up his fountain pen, and began to write. He did not speak to her. He did not acknowledge her. He wrote. Camila stood in that room and watched the man she thought she controlled become, for the first time in both their lives, genuinely unreachable. The study had not changed. The same desk, the same portraits, the same clock ticking on the mantelpiece. But the balance of power in that room had shifted so completely that they might as well have been standing in entirely different buildings. She had walked in intending to break him. She had instead broken something between them that no act of contrition, no gesture of reconciliation would ever be able to repair. The alliance. Later that same night, long after the palace had settled into its official silence, King Charles walked the corridors of Buckingham Palace with a different step. The hesitation that had always been part of his bearing, that slight tentativeness, the physical remnant of a lifetime of second-guessing, was absent. His leather soles struck the stone floor with a purpose that the palace walls had not heard from him before. He was heading toward the private study of the Prince of Wales. When William opened the door, no elaborate greeting passed between them, no careful diplomatic preamble. The kind of conversation that was about to happen does not require any of that. Charles sat down, and he told his son everything, every detail of what Camila had said, every threatening implication, every weaponized memory she had reached for in the desperate hope of pulling him back from the decision she feared most. He said it plainly, without embellishment, without the protective varnish that royals typically apply to family dysfunction. William listened with the stillness of a man exercising extraordinary self-control. His face revealed nothing unnecessary, but his hands, gripping the arms of his chair, Those betrayed the quiet fire of fury burning below the surface. In his father, at that moment, William saw two things simultaneously. He saw the king, the sovereign, who had just been subjected to a vicious betrayal of trust, and he saw the father, the complicated, flawed, deeply human man who had always struggled to close the emotional distance between them, and who was now, in the most unlikely of circumstances, reaching across it completely. What passed between them in that dimly lit study was not merely a political alliance. It was something more ancient and more powerful than that. It was the transfer of genuine trust between two men who shared blood and burden, across a generation of misunderstanding and missed connection. William was not simply supportive. He was strategic. He began immediately to map the next steps: the guest list for the follow-up meeting, the framing of the announcement, the management of the family's response. The sharp, decisive mind that had been quietly developing behind his careful public image was now fully visible. This was not a man who needed to be told what to do. This was a man who was already doing it. Dawn found them still working. When Charles finally rose and placed his hand on William's shoulder, a gesture so rare in their world of rigid ceremonial distance that it landed like an oath, something irreversible had been completed. The succession of the British monarchy had already happened. Not in a throne room, not under a crown, in a lamplit study, in the quiet hours before dawn, between a king stepping back and a king stepping forward. The final meeting. The second meeting was nothing like the first. Where the first had been unexpected, raw, emotional, blindsided by Camilla's interruption, this one was surgical. Every element had been considered in advance: the seating arrangement, the documentation prepared on the table, the specific individuals invited, and the specific individuals who would find themselves conspicuously isolated. Queen Camilla arrived wearing an emerald velvet ensemble, the effort of presentation clearly deliberate, the armor of a woman who understood that optics were now her only remaining weapon. But the moment she entered the room and processed the seating arrangement, William and Catherine positioned closer to the king than ever before, the color drained from behind her carefully composed expression. She swept the room for allies. She found none. The faces that had once offered her knowing glances and quiet solidarity now returned only careful neutrality. The winds had changed direction overnight, and every person in that room had noticed. Charles rose to speak, and the difference from the previous meeting was immediate and total. His voice carried no tremor of personal emotion. It rang out with the clarity and finality of a decision that had already been made, documented, and was now simply being announced. He restated the abdication. He laid out the roadmap with specific, irreversible detail. He did not look toward Camilla once. Not once. That deliberate avoidance, the complete absence of the instinct to seek her reaction that had characterized decades of their relationship, was itself the loudest statement in the room. Camilla tried to signal her opposition through body language, a slight shake of the head, a calculated sigh timed to interrupt the rhythm of Charles's words. She had intended to repeat her threats, to invoke the Gordonstown memories in front of the assembled family, and force Charles to back down. But then, her eyes met William's, and she stopped, because what she saw in that gaze was not the look of a threatened son. It was the look of a sovereign observing a political error being made in slow motion. William sat perfectly still, hands flat on the table, his presence radiating a quiet and overwhelming authority that required no words, no gestures, no raised voice. Beside him, Catherine's expression was equally resolute, composed, certain. The two of them together formed something that Camilla had simply not anticipated, an impenetrable wall of unified, generational purpose that rendered her resistance not merely ineffective, but faintly absurd. The other family members began to signal their agreement, one by one. Gentle nods, firm but undemonstrative. No one rose to defend the Queen's position. No one suggested the timing was too soon. The room had already delivered its verdict before Charles had finished speaking. The official document was placed on the table. William stood and accepted it from his father with an absolute respect that visibly moved even the most composed people present. Catherine offered a quiet smile, not triumphant, never triumphant, but the smile of a woman who understood the full gravity of the responsibility she was now accepting. Camilla did not move. She sat with her eyes fixed on the fading afternoon light on the opposite wall. The ship had sailed. The era she had spent her life navigating toward had closed behind her like a door pulled shut by someone else's hand, and all she could do was sit very still and absorb the reality of what total, irreversible political defeat actually feels like. The final speech. Word of the abdication reached the public in the way that the most seismic royal news always does, through a leak so carefully managed that it functions more like a planned announcement than an accident. The palace scheduled a formal address. King Charles would speak to the nation directly, a final speech, the last act of a reign defined by its patience, its complexity, and its extraordinary moment of self-sacrifice at the very end.
So whatever faith you have, or whether you have none, it is in this life-giving light.
The morning of the address, Buckingham Palace had a different quality to its silence. Staff moved through the corridors with the heightened awareness of people who understand they are living inside a historic moment. William and Catherine were present. Their 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, were somewhere within those same walls, the next generation of a dynasty that would carry this name forward for decades to come, perhaps centuries. Charles dressed with particular care that morning, not in the full regalia of state, not in the military splendor of ceremonial occasions. He chose something quieter, more personal, the understated dress of a man who is not performing power, but surrendering it, and doing so with grace. He stood at the podium and he looked out at the cameras, at the press, at the faces of the people who had watched him for his entire life, and he began to speak. He spoke of his mother, of the standard she had set that no monarch could reasonably hope to exceed. He spoke of service, not as an abstraction, but as the lived, daily, relentless practice of placing duty above every personal desire, every personal wound, every personal preference. He spoke of William and Catherine with a warmth that surprised even those closest to him. He did not simply transfer power, he bore witness to it. He described what he had seen in his son over the preceding years, the sharpness of his mind, the depth of his empathy, the iron in his resolve. And he described what he had always seen in Catherine from the very beginning, the extraordinary capacity for connection, the unshakable steadiness, the gift for making the institution feel human without making it feel diminished. He said that the decision he was announcing was not a retreat. It was, he believed, the greatest act of service he could offer, to step aside at the moment of his own choice, while still able to witness the succession clearly and ensure its foundation was solid. He did not mention Camila. Her name did not appear once in the speech. And in that silence, in that single deliberate omission, the British public understood everything they needed to understand about what had occurred behind those palace walls. He ended not with ceremony, but with something close to poetry. He looked directly into the camera, past the lens, past the editing suite, past the broadcast signal, and spoke to the people of Britain as directly as he had ever spoken to them about anything. He told them that the crown's greatest strength had never been the person wearing it. It had always been the people standing beneath it. And then King Charles III stepped back from the podium. The reign was over. The aftermath. In the days that followed, the world adjusted to a new reality. The formal preparations for the coronation of King William V and Queen Catherine moved forward with the precise, unhurried momentum of an institution that has been executing these rituals for 1,000 years. Dates were set, protocols were confirmed. The machinery of monarchy, that extraordinary ancient machine, turned its gears toward the next chapter. And Charles? Charles retreated to Highgrove with something that the people who know him best describe as visible relief. He walked his gardens. He tended his organic plots. He wrote, he read, he slept, reportedly, with a consistency that had eluded him for years. The man who had spent 7 decades waiting to become king had spent less than 3 years wearing the crown. And yet the judgment of history, or at least the early draft of it, seemed to suggest that his most significant act as monarch had been this: recognizing the moment when stepping forward meant stepping aside. Camila remained at Ray Mill House in Wiltshire. The separation between her and Charles, never officially confirmed, never publicly denied, became simply a fact of life that the palace's formidable communications operation neither acknowledged nor denied. She attended select ceremonial events. She performed select charitable obligations. She did so with the practiced composure of a woman who has survived worse. But the rooms she moved through were emptier than they used to be. The conversations were more formal. The warmth that had once defined her relationship with the institution had quietly but definitively cooled. William and Catherine stepped into the full light of their new role with a confidence that seemed to have been stored up and waiting.
My kiddies are very sad. We're going to have to keep it a big secret.
Their public engagements carried a different charge now. The crowds that gathered were responding not merely to symbols of the crown, but to people, specific, knowable, deeply human people, who were now carrying the weight of an institution on their shoulders and doing so with apparent steadiness. But here is the question that lingers even now, as the coronation preparations gather pace. Was Camilla's decision to reach into Charles's most private wounds and use them as leverage the defining mistake of her royal story? Or was it simply the moment when a truth that had always been present finally became impossible to conceal? Because ambition at the level Camilla operated never hides easily. It adapts, it manages, it presents itself as wisdom, as concern, as reasonable caution, and sometimes, in a moment of genuine threat, the mask slips, and what you see underneath is the thing that was always there. The British monarchy has survived abdication before. It survived Edward VIII and the constitutional earthquake of 1936. It survived the fire years of Diana's death and the public fury that followed. It has survived scandal and war, and the grinding cultural shifts of a modern world that grows less patient with hereditary privilege by the decade. It will survive this, but it will not emerge unchanged. The monarchy that William and Catherine inherit is not the monarchy that Charles received from his mother. It is smaller, in a sense, more transparent, more exposed to scrutiny than any version that came before it. The margin for error is narrower. The public's tolerance for the gap between royal presentation and royal reality has never been thinner. William knows this. You can see it in the way he operates. That combination of his mother's warmth and something distinctly his own. A strategic clarity that neither parent possessed in quite the same measure. And Catherine knows it too. She has faced the most personal of crucibles: illness, recovery, the restructuring of her own identity under unimaginable public pressure, and she has emerged from it with an authority that no title could have conferred. It was earned. Deeply, personally, irrevocably earned. The new era has begun. The story of King Charles III's abdication is not simply a story about power changing hands. It is a story about what happens when the personal and the political collide at the highest level, and about the extraordinary human cost of keeping an ancient institution alive in a modern world. Charles gave up the crown, but before he did, he gave up something harder. He gave up the belief that love, even complicated, hard-won, fiercely defended love, is enough to survive when the fundamental nature of a relationship has been revealed. Now the question is yours. Do you believe King Charles made the right call? Was stepping aside, at this moment, in this way, the act of a wise king finally at peace with his own limitations? Or was it the final chapter of a man who spent his entire life being pushed by forces beyond his control and simply ran out of resistance? And what about Camilla? Was her attempt to weaponize Charles's past a tactical error made in a moment of desperation? Or was it, as some have quietly suggested, the truest expression of who she had always been, a woman who understood that in the game of royal power, sentiment is just another tool? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. This conversation is far from over. If this story moved you, shook you, or made you see the royal family in a completely different light, hit like, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you never miss the moment when history decides to move. Because with this family, it always does.